We continue now at the top of Daf Samech Dalet Amud Beis and Meseches Bava Basra. This is Bava Basra Daf 64b. On the previous Amud, the Mishnah said that if a seller sells a house to a buyer, so that does not come along with the bore and the dose. The seller retains the rights to the pit or the cistern that's by the house. And there's a machlokas tanoim in the Mishnah. Rabbi Akiva says when it comes to a path to get to the bore and the dose, the seller does not get that. He has to buy that right from the buyer. It's not automatic. Whereas the Rabbanan say no, it's automatic if he's retaining for himself the bore and the dose. So he also retains for himself a path to the bore and the dose. And the Gemara now says we should suggest that what is the basis of the machlokas between Rabbi Akiva and the Rabbanan? The machlokas is the Rabbi Akiva savar, that Rabbi Akiva holds mocher be'ein yafim mocher, that when a person sells, he sells generously, and therefore when he's selling and he's retaining for himself the bore and the dose, that's all he's retaining for himself. But in terms of a path to get there, he has to buy that specifically from the buyer. For Rabbanan Savri, but the Rabbanan hold no, mocher ba'ayin ra mocher, that when a person sells, he sells in a stingy manner, and therefore he does retain for himself not only the bore and the dose, but the path to get there as well. And the Gemara continues with the Ka'amar Nami Bialman, that which we say in general. Rabbi Akiva Lataimi, that Rabbi Akiva follows his reasoning, Da'amar Mocher Ben Yafa Mocher, that Rabbi Akiva in general holds the person sells generously. Mehacha, that comes from over here. And the Rashbam explains, "V'da'amar nami bi'alma Rabbi Akiva l'tayme." Kilomar means to say as follows: "Midumukminon bi'alma shar dine mechira." In other cases of sales, Tetalo tamayu be'ein yafu ve'ein ra, where we talk about the fact that the machlokas Rabbi Akiva and the Rabbanan has to do with whether it's generously done or whether it's done in a stingy manner. Alibad Rabbi Akiva and Rabbanan, we find this machlokas already in other contexts between Rabbi Akiva and the Rabbanan. Kagon and Perecheskas Habatim. For example, we find it in Perecheskas Habatim earlier in this Mesechet. The Amron mochar ilanos v'shayar karka. If we say over there, if a person sells trees, but he retains the land for himself, plugs with Rabbi Akiva v'Rabbanan. There's a machlokas there between Rabbi Akiva and the Rabbanan. Till Rabbi Akiva yeshlo karka lebal ha'ilan. According to Rabbi Akiva, the owner of the tree still does retain certain rights to the land, meaning shemiyamus ha'ilan. Let's say the tree dies, yita acher b'makomo, he's able to plant another one in its place. Well, the Rabbanan ain't one. According to the Rabbanan, he does not have that right. So that machlokas that we find over here, we apply. It's all the same basic machlokas. We apply the same logic. The machlokas is whether mocher bein yafa mocher, or whether a mocher is bein ra mocher, whether he sells generously, or whether in a stingy manner. But the Gemara continues, Mimai, how do you know that's the case? How do you know that over here that's really the basis of the machlokas? Maybe there's a different machlokas that's happening in our Mishnah. Dilma, maybe Rabbi Akiva savar, maybe Rabbi Akiva holds, ein adam rotze sheyitein ma'osav v'yidrasu acherim. Rabbi Akiva holds a person doesn't want to pay money, and then he's going to have other people stepping on his property, meaning it's automatic when a person is buying property. Obviously, he's not giving the seller the rights to trample, to walk over his property, and so that's the reason why the seller has to buy the right to have a derech, to have a path to the bore and the dose. For Rabbanan Savri and the Rabbanan hold, ein adam rotze sheyitol mos v'yifrach ba'avir. A person's not going to take money, and then he's going to have to fly in the air, meaning to say a person's not going to sell the property and then retain the bore and the dose and have no way to get there, have no path to get there other than to fly, so to speak, in the air. And so that's why it's logical to say, and that's why the Rabbanan say that he retains for himself a derech, a path, in order to get to the bore and the dose. And the point is here you have that the basis of the argument is really an issue in terms of what people are thinking in this particular sale. What is a person giving money for? What is a person taking money for? But it has nothing to do with a general machlokas of whether mocher ba'ayin yafa mocher or mocher ba'ayin ra mocher. And so the Gemara continues, Ve'ela miseifa. Well, maybe we can say that it's from the end of the Mishnah that we see a machlokas about ayin yafa or ayin ra. It says at the end of the Mishnah, mochron la'acher. It says at the end of the Mishnah, let's say a person sells just the bore and the dose to somebody else. So now the person who's buying is the one who's buying just the bore and the dose. So there we also have a machlokas. Rabbi Akiva says, Eino tzarech likach lo derech. He doesn't need to purchase the rights for a derech, for a path, meaning the buyer automatically gets a path to that bore and the dose as well. The Chachamim omrim tzarech, and the Chacham say no, the buyer does need to buy the rights to the path. And so we'll say this is exactly the machlokas. The machlokas is whether it's be'ein yafa. According to Rabbi Akiva, he sells generously, and that's why the buyer gets the derech. And according to the Chacham, he sells in a stingy manner, and that's why the buyer does not get the derech. And the Gemara continues, Dilma, maybe b'hai pligi, maybe the machlokas is not about ayin ra or ayin yafa. Maybe the machlokas is in the following. The Rabbi Akiva savar, the Rabbi Akiva holds basar daita de lokeach azlinan. We follow the intentions of the buyer. For Rabbanan Savri and the Rabbanan hold basar daita de mocher azlinan, that we follow the intentions of the seller. And the Rashbam explains, V'dilma v'ha pligi, the Rabbi Akiva savar basar daita de lokeach azlinan. Kilomar, what it means to say is as follows. Bein Rabbanan, bein Rabbi Akiva, whether you're following the Rabbanan Rabbi Akiva, chashi You have over here two considerations in terms of claims. You have one claim of drisa, that a person does not want to sell, the person does not want to buy property and have someone else just walking all over his property. And then you have another claim of prichas avir, a person's not going to want to bore in a dose and have to fly in order to get there. Divitar vayu adam makvid. People are makvid on both. Both of these arguments are good. But what's happening in terms of the machlokas Tanaim in the Mishnah is Rabbi Akiva in general says that the strength of the buyer is strong, or his claims are always listened to when you have competing claims. B'chol makom, in all situations, sheyesh lo taina keneged hamocher, where he has a claim against the seller. V'yazol basar daiter delokech, and therefore we follow the intentions of the buyer. Mishum delo shadi inish zuzeh b'chti, because a person is not going to pay money, spend money for nothing. V'hayodeya hamocher shekavanas halokech liknos davar sholem. The seller realizes, the seller understands that the buyer wants to purchase a full item. Shelo yehei nifsad b'mechol klum. He doesn't want to lose out with what he's buying. Deino the mashlich ma'osav leibud. But a person's not going to throw his money and throw his money and let it be destroyed, let it be lost. Hilkach, therefore yad lokeach al halyona. Therefore the buyer always has the upper hand. V'lo chashin al latainas mocher negdo klal. We don't care about whatever claim the seller has. And so therefore, for example, when the buyer is the one that's buying the bore and the dose, automatically we assume that he also gets the derech, because we take more seriously the buyer's claim. And let's say the other way around. Let's say the buyer is the one buying the property and the seller is retaining for himself the bore and the dose. Again, we take the buyer's claim seriously, and we say the buyer does not want the seller to just be able to walk all over his property, and so the buyer retains that derech unless the seller purchases the rights for that derech. And the Rabbanan say the opposite. The Rabbanan follow the intentions of the seller. The person with the shtar has the lower hand, and therefore we're going to say it's not comparable to the other cases. For example, by the case we brought above, a person sells trees, but he leaves the land for himself. There you don't have these kind of claims and counterclaims of allowing someone to step on your property or having to fly through the air. So there you don't have that. So ematar vayu modus. So then they might both agree, oh ayin yafa, oh ayin ra, that is either it's ayin yafa or ayin ra, meaning ayin yafa and ayin ra is irrelevant in this particular case. Maybe it has nothing to do. You can't compare it to the case of the trees, for example, to our case over here by the bore and the dose. And the Gemara continues, V'yela mehar, rather let's bring a proof from the following Mishnah that Rabbi Akiva and the Rabbanan disagree in terms of whether a mocher is ba'ayin ra mocher or ba'ayin yafa mocher. The Mishnah later on says that if a person sells a field to a buyer, lo es habor, v'lo es hagas, v'lo es hashovach, it doesn't include, meaning the sale of the field does not include the pit, it does not include the wine press, it does not include the dovecotes, bein charevin, bein yeshuvin, whether those dovecotes are abandoned or whether they're being utilized, meaning to say none of those items are included in the sale of the field. The buyer is buying only the field and not these items. And then we have the same machlokas in this Mishnah as we had in our Mishnah. V'tzarech likach lo derech divrei Rabbi Akiva, v'chachamim omer meino tzarech. Rabbi Akiva says that the seller needs to purchase for himself a derech. If he wants a path to the bore or the gas or the shovach, he needs to buy it, meaning otherwise we assume that he does not get that path. Essentially, he sells generously to the buyer. And the chachamim say, no, he doesn't need to buy that for himself. We assume that he keeps for himself a path to the bore or the gas or the shovach. And so the Gemara says, Hasu lamali, what do we need to have the exact same machlokas for again? We just had this machlokas by a house. Now we have the same machlokas by a field. Elolav hakamash malon, rather is not teaching us. Rabbi Akiva savar mocher be'ein yafa mocher. Rabbi Akiva holds when a seller sells, he's selling generously. V'rabbanan savri mocher be'ein ra mocher, and the Rabbanan hold that when a person sells, he's selling in a stingy manner. He's not selling generously. And therefore we see that's a general machlokas between Rabbi Akiva and the Rabbanan. And the Gemara says not necessarily. V'dil ma'ashmein and bias, v'kamashmal on sada. Maybe the Mishnah before taught us this halacha by a house, and now the Mishnah coming up is teaching us this exact halacha by a field. Utzrich, and both of them are actually necessary. De'i ashmein and bias, because if we only had the Mishnah by a house, mishum deboitz niusas, over there we would say that a person requires privacy, meaning to say, Rabbi Akiva, for example, Rabbi Akiva says that the seller needs to purchase for himself the rights to the derech, because really we assume that the buyer does not give the seller those rights because he wants privacy. This is his house. And that's why Rabbi Akiva says what he says. Aval sada emalo, but by a field maybe he wouldn't say that. And you can make the argument the other way. V'yashmin and sada, if we only had this halacha by a field, mishum dekashi le davsha, because over there, the stepping on the field is something that's actually going to harm the field, that can harm the produce of the field. And so therefore, in a situation of a field, we would say that the buyer does not want to give the seller the right to walk through the property. That's why the seller has to buy that right. Aval bayis emalo, but by a house I might not not say that. And so maybe that's why we have a Mishnah by both a house and a field. And it's not because it's an extra Mishnah by field to teach us that there's a general machlokus between Rabbi Akiva and the Rabbanan, whether mocher ba'ayin yafa mocher or mocher ba'ayin ra mocher. And so the Gemara continues, Elami Seifa. Rather, let's bring a proof from the end of the upcoming Mishnah. The Mishnah is also talking about a field, but now it's talking about the contrasting case. Machron la'acher. Let's say the person who owned the field, he's not selling the field, but he's selling the other items to somebody else. He's selling the board to somebody else, or he's selling the gas, or he's selling the shovach to somebody else. So there we have the reverse machlokus. Rabbi Akiva Omer eino tzarech ligach lo derech. Rabbi Akiva says that the buyer does not need to purchase the rights to a derech, to a path, because that automatically comes with the sale. Again, it seems Rabbi Akiva is saying that the person who's selling sells generously. The Chachamim Omer tzarech, but the Chachamim say no, the buyer does need to purchase the rights to the derech, otherwise he doesn't have it. Hasu lamali. So why do we need another machlokus about the same thing? Hainu hach. It seems to be the exact same machlokus as everything we're quoting above. Elalav. Rather is it not? Hakamash malon. It's coming to teach us. To Rabbi Akiva savar mocher bein yafa mocher. Rabbi Akiva holds a person who sells, he sells generously. Rabbanan savar, and the Rabbanan say mocher ba'ayin ra mocher, that when a person sells, he sells in a more stingy manner. And the Gemara says shema mino. Indeed, you see that is the machlokus. That is the case. That Rabbi Akiva holds mocher ba'ayin yafa mocher, and the Rabbanan hold mocher ba'ayin ra mocher. And the Gemara continues, Itmar, it was stated, Rav Huna Amar Rav. Rav Huna says that Rav says, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Samech Hey Amud Aleph.